Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the life, death, and personality of John Edward Mack? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, consider supporting me on Patreon, and check out my podcast, Bella Grande Media, on YouTube. I will put the relevant links in the description for this video. So first I'll look at the background of John Edward Mack, then I'll move to my analysis. John Edward Mack was born in New York City on October 4, 1929. His father, Edward, was a professor at a university in New York. His mother, Eleanor, died when Mack was 8 months old. His father remarried, this time to Ruth P. Mack. She was an economist. This gave Mack a half-sister, Mary Lee Ingbar, who would later become a well-known professor herself. Mack graduated from a prestigious preparatory school in 1947, from college in 1951, and from Harvard Medical School in 1955. He trained to become a psychiatrist at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. During his time there, as well as later in his career, his training centered on psychoanalytic theory, a modality developed by Sigmund Freud, but expanded on by many other different theorists. It essentially features the role of the unconscious mind as a prominent figure. So this is where defense mechanisms come from. They're part of psychoanalytic theory. Mack married a social worker named Sally Stahl around this time and took her with him to Japan, where he was stationed after enlisting in the Air Force in 1959. Mack worked as a medic. Eventually, he would reach the rank of captain. The couple would have a son while in Japan. They would have 2 more sons later on. Mack returned to the Massachusetts Mental Health Center after his time in the Air Force was over in 1961. He went to work at Harvard Medical School in 1964. He became a full professor in 1972. 5 years later, he would become the head of psychiatry for the school, a position he maintained for the rest of his life. Even though John Mack would become famous for his unusual beliefs in the areas of aliens, hypnosis, and so-called repressed memories, he researched other areas as well, including adolescent counseling and heroin addiction. His main work at Harvard was actually exploring the effect of a person's perceptions of their environment on their relationships. During his career, Mack would publish over 150 articles as well as 11 books. Mack became active in trying to convince governments around the world to dismantle nuclear weapons, and he had an interest in trying to figure out what caused the Cold War. He was involved in several acts of civil disobedience. Mack did not develop an interest in alien encounters until July 10, 1990. It was on this day he met a man who claimed to have seen a UFO on Cape Cod in 1964. Mack was fascinated by the story and started interviewing people who claimed to have encountered aliens. He would go on to conduct research on this population. Traditionally, mental health professionals had discounted these individuals as having psychopathology, and there was really no effort to study the population from the perspective that they could be telling the truth. Before Mack took a real interest in this population, he believed the same thing. He thought these individuals had mental disorders. Over time, Mack started to change his mind. He noted that a wide variety of people made these reports, and he was impressed at how many of their stories had similarities. For example, abductees reported waking up paralyzed with a strange sense that there was a person in the room. The people were hit with a beam of light and transported into what appeared to be a spaceship. The aliens tended to be very interested in reproductive systems. The abductee sometimes had the sensation of flying. They often experienced missing time. They would have scars they could not explain and that did not appear to be self-inflicted. UFO sightings sometimes occurred in the community around the same time the participant reported the abduction. Many of the participants described their encounter with aliens as having a spiritual component, and it changed the way the participants viewed the world. Mack tended to believe that the participants were telling the truth. He would say that the UFOs were observed by the participants and they were abducted. However, he believed they were having some type of psychological and spiritual experience, the source of which was another dimension. He was implying that the aliens were real, but perhaps the abduction was some type of transcendental experience and not something that physically happened, like there was no spaceship that came down in the atmosphere and no beam of light that actually transported the people to that ship. He would later imply the participants had something similar to a vision quest, an experience featured in some Native American cultures. During one interview, Mack tried to walk a fine line between supporting the people he interviewed and remaining non-committal to the idea of alien visitors. He claimed that he would never say that aliens are abducting people, but he went on to say that there was a compelling, powerful phenomenon that he could not account for in any other way. Mack gained a reputation for believing in aliens and believing people who claimed to encounter aliens. To make Mack's situation worse, a woman who claimed to be posing as an abductee shared the details of her time being treated with Mack, and Time magazine featured the story. It was clear that Mack believed her story about the alien abduction, even though she had completely fabricated it, at least according to her account. She had said that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, she had been taken on board a spaceship along with Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. Her report would further cement Mack's reputation as a gullible clinician and scientist. Mack tried to redeem himself by going on the Oprah Winfrey Show, a well-known refuge for pseudoscientists and spiritual gurus. All this attention landed him in trouble in May of 1994, when an investigation was launched into Mack's clinical activities by Harvard Medical School. The concern that many of Mack's colleagues had about him was this whole situation where he believed people were encountering aliens. The committee that was put together to investigate Mack's behavior felt as though it was professionally irresponsible to tell a person who claimed to have a close encounter with an alien that their experience could be real. One committee member wrote, quote, "If these stories are believed as literal, factual accounts, they contradict virtually all the basic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology on which modern science depends," unquote. Other committee members accused Mack of bringing about a new dark age of superstition and magic. About 4 months into the Harvard investigation, Mack would travel to Zimbabwe to investigate an alleged UFO sighting that would become notorious. At the Ariel School in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, 62 children, ages 6 to 12, reported seeing a UFO and aliens on September 16, 1994. Mack interviewed the children and believed their stories, even though the most probable explanation was mass hysteria. Going back to the Harvard investigation, the total duration of the investigation was 14 months. The committee had accused Mack of 3 offenses. He had not done enough in his evaluations of the so-called alien abductees to rule out mental disorders. He put pressure on the participants to convince them that they had actually been abducted by aliens, and he prevented them from getting treatment delivered by a competent mental health clinician. The conclusion of the committee was that Mack had the academic freedom to study whatever he wanted and offer his opinions without interference, although they cautioned him against violating ethics. No official adverse action occurred against Mack based on these findings. Even though he was technically vindicated, the investigation and the information it brought to light was devastating to John Mack's reputation. Mack's marriage to Sally Stahl would end in 1995. John Mack had written a biography about T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. Mack was in London on September 27, 2004, to give a lecture at a conference sponsored by the T.E. Lawrence Society. Mack was walking home to where he was staying by himself after dinner. In the area, there was a silver Peugeot driven by a 50-year-old computer technician named Raymond Chakowski. Raymond had just left a military charity event in North London where he had consumed 5 or 6 pints of beer. John Mack exited the underground station at Totteridge and Whetstone not long after 11 p.m. Before crossing the street, he looked to the left. He walked directly into the path of Raymond, who was coming from the right. As an American, Mack was not accustomed to drivers on the left side of the road. Raymond slammed on the brakes but could not stop in time. Mack flew over the hood into the windshield, then over the roof, and landed on the ground. Mack would be pronounced dead a short time later. He was 74 years old. Raymond would later plead guilty to careless driving while under the influence of alcohol. He spent 6 months in jail and was not allowed to drive a vehicle for 3 years. Now moving to my analysis. John E. Mack is undoubtedly the most notorious mental health clinician and professor who believed in alien abduction. Many clinicians and academics who were skeptical about aliens believe that Mack legitimized the whole alien encounter phenomenon and misled people, fueling their delusions. Others who believe in alien abduction have declared John Mack as a hero who stood up against an academic establishment that promotes scientific materialism. Mack was somewhat troubled by the whole idea of alien encounters. He did believe in them, but he was not 100% sure. One thing in particular that really bothered him was the fact that he had never been abducted, seen a UFO, or encountered aliens in any way. Mack wondered if there was something wrong with him. Perhaps he didn't believe enough to attract the attention of the aliens. Interestingly, Mack was raised as a scientific materialist. His father believed that life was meaningless, and when people died, that was it. Mack was satisfied with this understanding of the world for many years, but would eventually come to believe that there was something more to life. There must be a spiritual component. Mack thought that perhaps alien encounters could shed light on this spiritual component. As Mack became more sure about aliens, he still tried to make it appear as though he was somewhat skeptical. In reality, he believed in aliens and had a number of theories about them. They were coming from a parallel universe to engage in a breeding program that would create alien-human hybrid offspring. So I guess he believed to some extent in alien lizard humanoids. He also believed the aliens would warn people about dangers to the planet, like the spread of nuclear weapons and pollution. People who were abducted would come out of the experience with a commitment to change their relationship to the Earth. I find this interesting because Mack had been an activist against nuclear weapons long before his interest in aliens. It's almost like he was recruiting the aliens to spread his message. Mack was such a true believer in aliens that other people who believed in aliens were critical of him. Even the guy that he met who reported seeing a UFO at Cape Cod in 1964 believed that John Mack was gullible. I think the bottom line with John Mack is that he simply believed in the stories that people were telling him about the alien encounters. He found this population to be highly credible. He didn't think there was any reason they would lie about the experience. They didn't have anything to gain. And, as I mentioned, he found many similarities in their stories. Mack did not believe there was an alternate explanation. He claimed that he ruled out not only mental illness, like delusions, but also sleep paralysis and deception. Let's take a look at a potential personality profile for John E. Mack. When I conceptualize personality, I often use the 5-factor model. I remember the 5 factors through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. As far as openness to experience, it seems like John Mack is very high. He invested in fantasy, he was creative, and he appeared to experience emotions intensely. We see that he was highly conscientious. He was fairly cautious and deliberate. He had a great work ethic. He was perhaps a little bit above average in extroversion. He was friendly and outgoing. I think he wasn't too high in that trait, though, because he was also analytical. As far as agreeableness, he was high in agreeableness. He was altruistic, trusting, perhaps a little too trusting, and he was fairly modest. We see with neuroticism that Mack appeared to be quite low. He did not seem to be fearful, depressed, anxious, or vulnerable. In a sense, I think the manner of John Mack's death was a metaphor related to the way he approached the investigation of alien abductees. He simply wasn't looking the right way. There was a whole direction that he was missing. He didn't think he was missing anything because he thought he understood the framework, but he made a fundamental error which led to other mistakes. He dismissed a traditional explanation. In reality, there are naturalistic explanations for alien abduction experiences. In my opinion, awareness of sleep paralysis probably explains most alien abduction stories. I talked about this in detail in a video I did about alien abduction, but I will offer a summary of that theory here. During REM sleep, muscles are paralyzed. Sometimes a person is consciously aware of it. This is called awareness of sleep paralysis. About 25 to 40% of the population has experienced this. A person could feel pressure on their chest during this. They have an increased heart rate. They have trouble breathing. They have feelings of anxiety or dread. They have a sense of floating, spinning, or being out of one's body. They may also have hallucinations, both visual and auditory, like lights, demons, footsteps, and buzzing noises. The alien abduction narrative is a way to explain all these experiences. But even still, most people who have sleep paralysis do not think they had an alien encounter. The crucial element here is how personality fits in. People who claim to have been abducted by aliens tend to be creative, distrustful, and tend to have cluster A personality features, like magical thinking and odd beliefs. Alien abduction stories are really probably just a combination of awareness of sleep paralysis and certain personality traits. So what are my final thoughts on John Mack? I think John Mack was frustrated with the limits of the scientific method, like he wanted to prove something theological using science, which of course is a mismatch, because by definition, science always comes up with a materialistic explanation. It does not have the ability to comment on anything theological. No matter how many stories of alien abductions John Mack collected, no matter how similar they were, the determination from the scientific method would always be something other than aliens. Many clinicians and scientists dismiss Mack out of hand. To them, there's just no place for believing that aliens abduct people. They assume that Mack just desperately wanted to believe in the stories and suffered from a confirmation bias, so he only saw the evidence that supported the conclusion that he drew in the beginning. They think that he was only believed by anyone because of his Ivy League affiliation. People were starstruck, believing that Ivy League schools are somehow better than other schools. I think that John Mack was just trying to figure things out. I don't think he was trying to be a bad clinician or a poor scientist. After watching an interview he did with Charlie Rose, I was left with the impression that Mack was trying to be authentic. He was willing to be proven wrong. He just wanted people to be open to a number of possibilities, to explore this area of alien encounters with him. I think the lesson we can learn from John Mack is to entertain any possibility, however unlikely. A lesson that we can learn from his shortcomings would be to explore personality angles before packing one's bag for an alien vacation. Those are my thoughts on John Edward Mack. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.